morning, HSM. I hope that you all are having a great Sunday morning. We're glad that you were able to join us on YouTube Live. I'm glad that we can be safe and connected this way. Before we dive into service this week, we have a couple announcements for you. The first is that life groups are on Thursday nights, 7 to 8:30. For now, we will continue having them in person, but if we have any updates to that, we will let you know. If you're not a part of our texting group, feel free to email us your phone number or text me, text Ryan, text one of the leaders, and we'll make sure we get you on that texting group as well. Also keep an eye out for weekly email updates as well, because we'll have information of upcoming events and programs and everything you need to know then. In addition, there's also Women's Time this Monday, 5 p.m. on Zoom. We'll spend some time connecting with each other, doing a little bit of a devotional together, and just encouraging each other with a time of prayer. Other than that, keep praying for Ryan as he is healing, recovering from his nasal surgery. It went really well from what I've heard, and he's doing well and resting at home. So keep praying for him, praying for their family, for Dot, for Lorelai, and Johan, just as they have this time together and as he recovers. We're going to go into a time of worship right now, followed by a message. I'll be bringing week 2 of our series, Bittersweet. Challenge you to process through the questions, look back through the passages, and just see how God is working in your heart as you move towards forgiveness for yourself or for others in your life.
Sing it with me. Sometimes on this journey, I get lost in my mistakes. What looks to me like weakness is a canvas for your strength. My story isn't over, my story's just begun. Failure won't define me, 'cause that's what my Father does. Failure won't define me, 'cause that's what my Father does. Ooh, lay your burdens down. Ooh, here in the Father's house, check your shame at the door, 'cause it ain't welcome anymore. Ooh, you're in the Father's house, yeah. Arrival's not the end game, the journey's where you are. You never wanted perfect, you just wanted my heart. And the story isn't over, the story isn't good. Failure's never final when the Father's in the room. Come on! Failure's never final when the Father's in the room. Oh, lay your burdens down. Oh, here in the Father's house, check your shame at the door, 'cause it ain't welcome anymore. Oh, you're in the Father's house. All right, church, if you believe these truths, I want to hear you sing it, okay? We are in the church choir this morning. Let's sing it out. Prodigals, come home. Prodigals, come home. Yes. The helpless find hope. Love is on the move when the Father's in the room. Come on. Prison doors fling wide, the dead come to life. Love is on the move when the Father's in the room. Miracles take place, the cynical find faith. Love is breaking through when the Father's in the room.
summer of 2015, I met Owen Wilson. It's true. It was by the Spanish Steps in Rome. I was with my family. And before you get too excited about it, by met, I mean ran into. And our interaction lasted probably all of 3 seconds. It didn't actually start out too strong. See, right when I saw him, out of excitement and probably a total brain fart, I excitedly shouted out to my sister, "Jeannie, it's Marley!" He was walking in the opposite direction as we were, and as I passed him, I stopped him and asked if I could take a picture. Because that's what you do with celebrities, right? But much to my disappointment, he said no. And I think I took it way too personally and was upset at the time, and quite possibly for some time after that. And maybe I'm still upset now. And I may or may not, subconsciously or consciously, have avoided all Owen Wilson movies. But I'm glad I had watched Marley and Me and The Night at the Museum before, because those are some classics. But anytime someone would bring up Owen Wilson, I would tell them the story just like I did and I'm doing right now. And in a way, it's almost like I've got some unforgiveness against Owen Wilson. And you'll probably never know. But while this was a silly example, I think we do this with people in our lives more often than we'd like to admit. Whether it's holding on to bitterness, associating someone with a negative situation or a negative experience that we've had with them, or even making our dislike for a person known by the way we talk about them, or a way that we've experienced them to others. In our frustration and anger, there's this gnarly desire to expose what the other person did to us, to get even and to distance ourselves or even see other people around us distancing themselves from that person. And in those situations where we've been really hurt, even the idea of forgiveness can seem weak, irresponsible, and completely unfair. And I think this reaction to hurt and wrongdoing is further informed and reinforced by culture today. Because if we spend long enough scrolling on social media, watching TV, or skimming through celebrity news, we'll see this play out with a number of people who get canceled because of something they've done or something they've said. The spotlight is on them, and they're being called out and essentially deemed despicable, irrelevant, and trustworthy. A New York Times podcast defined the word cancel as a total disinvestment in something. Total disinvestment. Or in other words, complete separation. An absolute cutting off. I found this graphic that I think pretty accurately describes or exemplifies cancel culture. What is intense and powerful about cancel culture is this mob mentality that comes with it. There's finger pointing, defaming, and condemnation in the public sphere. However, a public cry for accountability and justice can often look like a mob that's out for blood, rather than redemption and reconciliation. And unfortunately, cancel culture has trickled into our individual relationships, and even our relationships with one another as the body of believers. I think we can unfortunately act in a way that others, members of our own body, by canceling them from our life and our community, and as Sandy pointed out the other week in main service, instead of leaning into conversations with love and a listening ear, we're pushing them away. And as we dive deeper into this series, I want to pose a question for all of us this morning. How can we, as the body of believers, live differently? How can we graciously confront and respond to wrongdoing with both justice and mercy? And what does God's forgiveness mean for how we see the people who have hurt us? And as we reflect on these questions this morning, I think it'd be helpful for us to take a look at the passage in the Bible where Jesus encounters a woman who has been canceled by the mob of her time. It's in John 8, verses 2 to 11. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery." In the law, Moses commanded us, to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap, in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time. The older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." I think it's worth noting that in the previous chapter, there was a lot of division about who Jesus was. The crowds were whispering various things about him. Some were even trying to seize him, and the chief priests and teachers of the law even sent out people to arrest him. Jesus was a pretty popular topic of conversation, and many in the crowds, particularly the Pharisees, were offended by what he was teaching, and they wanted to publicly discredit him. However, at the start of this passage, we see that Jesus chooses to go into the temple courts and boldly teaches large crowds in the most public place in Jerusalem. But now, as I just mentioned, the teachers of the law wanted to discredit Jesus and his ministry, and they had a play of their own. They also wanted to be in public view. And as we read in verses 3 and 4, they make the woman stand in front of the whole crowd, and then they pose a question to Jesus. Now, their act was intentional and calculated. They had planned this. They were looking to embarrass both the woman and Jesus at the same time. One of the commentaries that I read highlighted that it was unnecessary for the Pharisees to bring her in there. But they did because there was a vindictiveness against her in addition to the charges. Basically, they were just using her as a pawn to trap Jesus in his ministry. In that scenario, there must have also been a man involved in order for it to be an act of adultery. But he wasn't brought before Jesus. It was just her. And in that time, the standard for evidence for such a crime was really high. There had to be 2 witnesses. Their testimony had to be perfectly aligned, and they had to see the actual act taking in place. Just seeing a man and a woman leaving the same room or even lying on the bed wasn't sufficient evidence enough. And if the intentions weren't clear enough, their Pharisees' intentions in bringing her to Jesus, they then officially indict the woman in front of him and proceed to tell him what was written in the Mosaic law. Their question of, "What do you say, Jesus?" is a trap for him because they wanted him to be in a dilemma. If Jesus were to say, "Let her go," then he would be breaking the law of Moses in front of a crowd, no less. And on the other hand, if he were to say, "Stone her," or "execute her," he would be breaking the Roman law. And the Romans had taken the right of official execution for religious offenses away from the Jews. All along, their goal going into this public scene was to test him and find something to accuse him with. And they were willing to use this woman to serve that purpose. But look back to how Jesus responds in verse 6. He doesn't actually respond to their question, verbally, at least. He bends down and he starts drawing on the ground with his finger. It's funny because when I was talking to Randon about Jesus' interactions with the Jewish teachers earlier this week, he said, Jesus doesn't play games. Or, well, I guess he does play, but not the way they want. And that's exactly what's happening here. Like a few commentaries that I read mentioned that Jesus here was de-escalating a very intense and shame-filled scene, which I think expresses his care for the woman and her dignity. He's drawing the attention away from her, and also through his posture, his willingness to stoop low down to the ground is showing humility. And after the Pharisees continue to question him, he responds again, but again, not as they expect him to. His answer is brilliant. And even though it's a statement, it almost serves as more of a question to the crowd. Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. Even though they are the accusers in this situation, they're brought into the questioning. And they're challenged to consider the authority which with they seek to condemn this woman. And following this statement, he doesn't take the same posture as the Pharisees did, one of intimidation and pride, but rather he stoops back down to write on the ground again. Jesus wasn't joining in to a culture of pointing fingers and shaming or condemning, and this wasn't his mic drop moment. This was a moment he was giving them to privately examine their hearts. And what I love about this was that Jesus wasn't drawing attention to their sin or to hers in this moment. It was to neither one, and he didn't have to. They were convicted by their conscience. They had walked into the temple courts with an air of righteousness and what they thought was the intent of seeking justice. But in that moment, they were convicted of the need for both in their lives. And it says, those who heard went away one by one, the oldest to the youngest. The contrast between how they came in and how they left is amazing. They entered in with this frenzy, this energy, this intensity of a mob, prompted by their desire to draw attention to Jesus and the woman and embarrass the woman. But they left in a slow procession of people, one by one, from oldest to youngest, prompted by their own hearts. And it's not clear why they left in order of age, but perhaps it could be they were most easily the older people who understood that Jesus was talking about them. Perhaps the older people knew they had been caught, whereas the younger men weren't quickly ready to give up the fight. This week I learned about the Brazil nut tree. It's one of the most impressive trees, reaching the height of 200 feet. And of course, it produces, if anyone can guess, Brazil nuts. And here on the screen is a picture of the Brazil nut tree. Believe it or not, the Brazil nut tree has an enemy, the strangler fig. And the strangler fig, as you can guess from its name, grows on host trees and slowly chokes them to death. But that death is usually a long and excruciating process for the host tree. They plunder the moisture and the nutrients that the host tree needs and encircles its supply of food and water, ultimately killing the tree. And eventually, after decades, the tree dies, encased in the strangler. You see, at first, the strangler fig starts out as tiny, almost invisible seeds. And afterward, tiny roots then gain their footholds. And finally, the root creeps down the trunk and wraps tight around the whole tree. And I think that's how it starts in our hearts. When we let bitterness, pride, and unforgiveness towards ourselves or others become footholds. Initially, our hearts don't look all that bad. The bitterness doesn't seem like a threat. But then we start to forget the truth that we ourselves need grace and mercy and forgiveness from our Heavenly Father. And we start to become unaware of that bitterness, pride, and unforgiveness. And that impacts not only the way we see ourselves, but the way we see and treat others as well. You see, in this passage, I think Jesus was challenging everyone in the crowd, from oldest to youngest, to acknowledge that hardened state of their hearts. Their hearts were being encased with bitterness. And with a simple response, he was prompting them to acknowledge, whether it was large encasing roots or those smaller footholds, oldest to youngest, their own sin and personal bitterness. And finally, after the crowd had left, Jesus asked the woman a question. And by giving her a chance to respond, he enables her to take off the weight of the guilt and the shame and the sentence that she had been expecting all along. There was no one there left to condemn her. And Jesus, though he was without sin and he had the right to cast the first stone, didn't condemn her either. And it's significant that when he sends her on her way, He tells her to leave her life of sin. Jesus recognizes that what the woman had done was sin, but instead of confronting her publicly and condemning her, he gives her a word of hope. Hope for a life of change, hope for a life of freedom. And rather than shaming her, writing her off, or canceling her, he establishes connection with her. Instead of othering her and considering her beyond forgiveness, he sets her free from shame and gives her hope for a changed life. Guys, this is the beauty of how God confronts and responds to sin. He doesn't accept it or approve of it. He's willing to call it what it is. But he does that with love and mercy and compassion and a desire to draw us into relationship, not cast us aside. He doesn't want to shame us or distance himself from us, but he wants to extend love and forgiveness when we least deserve it. Romans 5:8 says this, "But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." While we were far off from him, going our own way, choosing life apart from him, he looked at what we did, and he didn't dismiss us. He loved us and then dismissed our sins. God didn't cancel us. He canceled our wrongs. Understanding that we have been forgiven is a crucial truth. And if we want to be a community marked by forgiveness, it's not one that we can just ignore or passively accept. Understanding how God sees us will transform the way we see ourselves and the way we see others. So, what does forgiveness mean for how we respond to wrongdoing? How will we choose to respond? I like how Tim Keller presents two options in his book, The Reason for God. He says, the first option is to seek ways to make the perpetrator suffer for what they have done. You can withhold relationship and actively initiate or passively wish for some kind of pain in their lives commensurate to what you experienced. There are many ways to do this. You can viciously confront them, saying things that hurt. You can go around to others to tarnish their reputation. There is another option, however. You can forgive. Forgiveness means refusing to make them pay for what they did. However, to refrain from lashing out at someone when you want to do so with all of your being is agony. It is a form of suffering. You not only suffer the original loss of happiness, reputation, and opportunity, but you now forego the consolation of inflicting the same on them. You are absorbing the debt, taking the cost of it completely on yourself instead of out on the other person. It hurts terribly. Many people would say it feels like a kind of death. Yes, but it is a death that leads to resurrection instead of a lifelong living death of bitterness and cynicism. A lifelong living death of bitterness and cynicism, or life that leads to resurrection. This death is one we see so clearly through Jesus and his sacrifice for us. The call for believers, for us who have received and tasted of forgiveness offered through Christ, is to extend that same forgiveness to others. And unlike that death brought about by the strangler fig, one of hard-heartedness and bitterness, it's a choice to die to our desire to see the other person hurt for the hurt they have caused, or to take justice for wrongdoing into our own hands. Paul says this in Colossians 3:13. He says, "Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you." I think this is what this looks like, as we saw Jesus do with the woman caught in adultery. It's this: we cancel the debt and not the person. Cancel the debt and not the person. Which means we can call out the thing that was wrong, but we refuse to see the person as only that wrong thing. When we see them, we continue to see them as an imperfect human, and we decide to see them as God sees them, and to see us as God sees us, as people worthy of love, and not just the sum of our wrongdoings. We choose to forgive them, rather than holding their wrongdoing against them. We choose to release them from shame and condemnation and draw them in, rather than holding them under that weight and pushing them away. Now, let me take a quick second to make sure I'm being clear. I'm by no means saying that people who treat you unfairly, abuse you, or take advantage of you get a pass to keep on doing that. If you are experiencing abuse, this is your encouragement and permission to have a conversation with a trusted adult. Forgiveness does not mean continuing in a relationship with those who continually hurt us or turning an eye to the wrong that has been done. There are times when we will need to set healthy boundaries or even end a friendship or relationship. And this can be really painful. I've walked through this myself last year with a close friend. And if you're walking through or have walked through either of those situations, I am so sorry. And I pray that God would continue to heal and transform and redeem and release both you and that other person from those wounds. So how do we move towards forgiveness? How do we cancel the debt and not the person? In his book, The Return of the Prodigal, Henry Nouwen presents 3 postures that reflect the heart of our Father and the heart of the one who welcomes us home. And I think these 3 postures, grief, forgiveness, and generosity, enable us to move from a response of canceling others and holding on to bitterness to a response of mercy and compassion. The first posture that will enable us to cancel the debt and not the person is grief. We know that forgiveness is painful, and I think it's right for us to acknowledge how hard it is and to not suppress it or waive it, but to grieve and lament the pain, the hurt, the sin, the lostness that we see and experience each day in our own hurts, in our relationships, in the world around us. Because grief opens our eyes to our own brokenness, and it opens our hearts to each other in genuine solidarity. What is the pain, the loss, or the hurt you're grieving? Is there someone you need to extend forgiveness to, or something that's really painful that you need to bring to the Lord in prayer? Be real with Him in how painful it is, because He sees and knows your heart. Nouwen writes this: I am beginning to see that much of praying is grieving. The grief is so deep, not just because the human sin is so great, but also, and more so, because the divine love is so boundless. To become like the Father, whose only authority is compassion, I have to shed countless tears and so prepare my heart to receive anyone, whatever their journey has been, and forgive them from this heart. Man. You see, this kind of grief, this prayer, enables us to move on to the second posture, which is forgiveness. Nouwen describes this forgiveness as a discipline of stepping over the wall that we have put between ourselves and those who have wronged us, and letting go of bitterness, pride, and resentment. Who might you be mentally canceling or only seeing as the wrong that they did? And what do you need to do to start seeing them or seeing yourself as God does, worthy of love and forgiveness? How can you show compassion through your words and actions and extend forgiveness that way, through the way you speak about them, or the way you speak to them, or the way you speak about yourself? And finally, the third thing, perhaps the most challenging, especially towards people who have hurt us or people we don't particularly agree with, is the posture of generosity. We have a God who generously gives us all that we need, and He is generous with His grace, His compassion, His love, and His care. How can we extend that generosity to those around us? How can we, instead of being stingy, our initial reaction with our time, our energy, and our money, how can we be generous with those who are hard to love and choose to serve them instead? How might God be asking you to extend hospitality or help meet a practical need for someone who might be hard to love? How might He be stirring in your heart to move toward that person rather than moving away? Again, forgiveness is no easy task, especially in a cultural moment where it seems easier to cancel someone, and especially in hard situations where it might seem easier to hold on to that bitterness and hurt than to let it go, because it takes work. But I pray that we, in light of God's forgiveness, however, would live differently, that we would cancel the debt, not the person, that we would respond with forgiveness. Again, how do we cancel the debt and not the person and respond with forgiveness? Let's pray and ask God to work and move and soften our hearts today. God, we thank you so much that you are the God of forgiveness. We thank you for the forgiveness and love and care and compassion that you have extended to us, even though we least deserved it, God. I pray that you would break down the walls in our hearts, break down the bitterness, break down the pride, break down the unforgiveness. I pray that you would help us to step over that wall, to step into forgiveness. I pray that you would help us step into these three postures, God, of grace, of forgiveness, of generosity. I pray that we would be able to take that hurt to you. And I pray that we would have trusted people in our lives, Lord, who we can bring those things to, Lord, not to shame the other person, God, but to actively work through this pain, Lord, that we can move to a posture of forgiveness. I pray that you would help us to cancel the debt and not the person, just as you have done for us. And I pray that you would show us each individually this week what that can look like. I pray all of this in your name, Jesus. Amen.
Alone in my sorrow and dead in my sin, lost without hope with no place to begin. Your love made a way to let mercy come in. When death was arrested and my life began. Will you sing with me, church? And ash was redeemed, only beauty remained. And my orphan heart was given a name. The morning grew quiet, my feet rose to dance. When death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace, so free, washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. Released from my chains, I'm a prisoner no more. Shame was a ransom, you faithfully bore. You canceled my debt and he called me his friend. That's when death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace, so free, washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. A Savior display on a criminal's cross. Darkness rejoiced as though heaven is lost. But then Jesus arose with our freedom in hand.
We are so glad that you could join us this morning and that we get to have this community with each other. We know that forgiveness is a really hard topic. It's a really hard thing to put into practice, but we want to be there for each other. We're here for you as you process what you heard this week and last week, and we really hope that we can be trusted people for you and that you can be trusted people for each other. Our challenge to you is to keep these conversations, to keep this reflection going. Something that's been really helpful for me, even the last couple weeks, has been journaling and just asking God to bring to mind different pieces of my heart, whether it's bitterness or unforgiveness or even areas of my own life or situations where I need to extend forgiveness to myself. And that's been so powerful just to reflect on and journal and talk it out with the Lord. So, we're excited to talk more about this in life groups on Thursday. And as always, we're always here for you, whether it's coffee or a virtual coffee date. Text us, call us, reach out to any of our leaders, because that's why we're here. And that's why we're all gathering together to do life together as a community, as a body. We hope that you have a great rest of your week, and we will see you on Thursday.